The sharp edge of the glass shimmered inside my mug just as I raised it to my lips. A thin, cruel sliver floating in the middle of what should have been the start of a quiet morning. And for a long second I just stared at it, unsure if it was real, or if the universe had finally decided to get metaphorical with me. I hadn't noticed a chip before, but that didn't mean it hadn't always been there, maybe hiding beneath layers of habit. Like so many other small cracks in my life I'd chosen to ignore until they suddenly revealed themselves with unforgiving clarity. I placed the cup down carefully, no rush, as if moving too quickly might shatter more than porcelain, and glanced toward the kitchen window where the city sunlight slid across the countertop like it didn't care about my epiphanies or the questions that had started burning in my chest. The rest of the apartment felt unusually still, like it was holding its breath along with me, except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the wall clock that had been a wedding gift from a couple we no longer spoke to. His suitcase had been parked by the front door since last night, lined up perfectly with the welcome mat as if he couldn't even allow a departure to be messy, the way everything in his world had always been, organized, scheduled, untouched by chaos or emotion. He'd kissed me this morning without really looking at me, one hand holding his phone, eyes flicking across the screen, muttering something about a delayed meeting as if we were two co-workers crossing paths in a break room instead of two people who used to whisper at 2 a.m. just to hear each other breathe. I hadn't said much either, just nodded and watched the elevator doors slide shut between us, and when I turned back into the apartment, I realized I didn't miss him. I just missed feeling missed. I stepped outside onto the small balcony off our bedroom, gripping the coffee mug by its rim now, as if holding it like that might keep the damage from spreading, and let the crisp morning air hit my face with the kind of honesty I hadn't felt from a human being in months. Across the narrow alley in the backyard of the duplex next door, someone stepped out barefoot onto the patio, earbuds in, t-shirt slung over one shoulder, stretching like he belonged in his own skin in a way I hadn't in years. And for a second I thought he hadn't noticed me, but then he turned, locked eyes with me and gave a nod, not a wave, not a hello, just a quiet acknowledgement that I existed. It wasn't flirtation, not really, more like recognition, like when two strangers catch each other's eye in a waiting room and silently agree they're both somewhere they don't want to be. I didn't wave back. I just stood there, clutching the damaged mug and wondering how long it had been since someone looked at me without seeing laundry or dinner plans or unpaid bills. That night I got a text from my friend across the street, inviting me for wine under the new string lights she hung up last week, and I almost said no, but something in me, something small and persistent, said go. Her patio looked like something out of a catalog. Cozy cushions, flickering lanterns, the scent of lavender from a potted plant that hadn't bloomed in weeks. And I let myself enjoy it for once, swirling the wine in my glass while we talked about work, groceries, the weather, all the usual things women talk about when they're avoiding what really matters. I was halfway through my second glass when her back door opened and he stepped out, that same guy from the yard, only this time dressed in jeans and a soft gray shirt, holding a bowl of chips like it was just another Thursday night and not a slow earthquake under my skin. He cracked a joke about my friend's salsa being a fire hazard and I laughed harder than I meant to, maybe harder than the joke deserved, because sometimes laughter slips out when you've been holding your breath too long. We talked about nothing and everything, and at one point he refilled my glass, his fingers brushing mine just for a second. And it wasn't exactly on purpose, but it wasn't an accident either, and later, just before he left, he turned toward me with this half-smile and said, "You seem more interesting than you pretend to be," before disappearing into the warm evening air like a secret that didn't ask permission to be remembered. The video call connected with a slight delay, just enough time for me to catch my own reflection in the dark screen, hair a little too neat, face a little too tired. And then there he was, sitting in some anonymous hotel room with stiff curtains and corporate art, eyes already flitting between me and whatever email he had pulled up on his laptop. He said my name like it was a meeting reminder, asked if I'd paid the water bill, mentioned a client dinner, and smiled in that tight way that suggested his head was already 3 steps ahead in another conversation entirely. And I listened, nodding at the right moments, but something inside me curled away, shrinking from the cold efficiency of it all. I said, "You seem distracted," and he blinked like I'd broken some kind of unspoken rule, then forced a chuckle and replied, "Just a long day," before glancing at his watch like the call was a box he'd just checked. When the screen went black, I sat there staring at my own faint reflection again, not quite sure why I felt more alone after talking to him than I had before the call even started, and I closed the laptop a little harder than necessary, feeling the tension ride up my spine like a pulled zipper. Later that afternoon, I took a walk to clear my head, just around the block, no destination, just movement, the way people do when they want to feel like they're going somewhere even if they're not. And as I turned the corner by the coffee shop with the crooked chalkboard sign, I almost ran straight into him. The guy from last night, with sunglasses hanging from his shirt collar and a to-go cup in one hand, the other already reaching to steady me as we both paused mid-step. He smiled first, said, "Hey small world," and I mumbled something polite, suddenly aware of every detail. The light scruff on his jaw, the way his eyes didn't dart around like he was trying to escape the moment, the fact that he actually looked at me like he meant it. We stood there long enough for it to get slightly awkward, and then he said he was doing freelance work, something digital and flexible, and that he was crashing at my friend's place for a couple of weeks while he sorted out housing, and I nodded like I'd already known that, even though I hadn't, and before I could think of a graceful way to leave he added, "Hope I didn't weird you out last night," with a crooked grin that made it worse and better at the same time. When I got back I found my friend pruning her backyard herbs and watching me like she'd seen the whole thing from behind the hydrangeas, and as I passed her the bag of groceries I'd picked up she laughed and said, "Girl, you need to loosen up, always walking around like someone gave you the keys to the school and told you not to let anyone touch anything." And I rolled my eyes but didn't argue because she wasn't wrong. That evening she invited him to join us for dinner on the patio. Just a casual thing with grilled vegetables, too much garlic bread, and a bottle of red we opened without waiting for a reason, and the conversation slid around easily. Music, travel, old sitcoms, and I felt myself laughing in a way that wasn't just polite or automatic. At one point someone dropped a fork and we all reached to grab it at the same time, our arms tangling under the table like the moment had a will of its own, and his hand brushed against my thigh, not lingering, not aggressive, just there. My breath caught, not from panic but from the sheer audacity of how alive that 1 second felt, and he pulled his hand back just as quickly, eyes focused on his plate, and for the rest of the night, neither of us said a word about it, but it was like a thread had been pulled somewhere beneath the surface, unraveling something I hadn't realized was already coming loose. I hadn't planned to stop by, but the forgotten tote bag sat on my passenger seat like a silent nudge, my friend's sunglasses poking out the top, her book half open as if she'd only just stepped away, and something about the familiarity of it, the careless way people leave parts of themselves behind, made me turn the wheel toward her house before I could talk myself out of it. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the porch steps as I rang the bell twice, then knocked, and when no one answered I pushed the door open just enough to peek inside, calling out casually like it wasn't weird, like I had a reason to be there other than the quiet pull I hadn't admitted to yet. The hallway was still, shoes by the door, a light on in the kitchen, and I stepped in slowly, half expecting her to come around the corner brushing off flour or waving a phone, but instead I saw him, barefoot, shirtless, in a pair of worn-in gym shorts, slicing strawberries with surprising precision, earbuds in and completely unaware that he wasn't alone. For a few seconds I just watched him, the ease in his movements, the faint rhythm of whatever song was playing leaking from his headphones, and then I cleared my throat louder than necessary, startling him just enough to make him laugh as he tugged one earbud out and said, "You caught me mid-chef mode." I smiled without thinking, holding up the bag like it was a peace offering, saying something about the book, the glasses, how I didn't mean to intrude, and he waved it off like it was the most normal thing in the world that I'd just walked into his borrowed kitchen like I belonged there. He pointed to the cutting board, offered a slice, and when I hesitated he said, "They're sweeter than they look," with a grin that could have passed for harmless if it hadn't landed directly under my skin. I took one, let it sit on my tongue a second longer than I needed to, and then we were laughing about something dumb. The way he cut the fruit, the way I said, apparently, too often I can't even remember now, and suddenly the space between us shifted like gravity had leaned in without warning. He reached for another piece but his hand paused halfway, eyes searching mine for a beat, and then he leaned in just enough for me to freeze, not in fear but in that suspended breath you take when something is about to happen that you know will split time in half, and then he kissed me. It wasn't wild or desperate or hungry. It was slow, purposeful, as if he was testing the shape of something he'd imagined and decided not to wait for permission to find out. My lips didn't move at first, too stunned to respond, and my brain screamed that this was reckless, stupid, wildly inappropriate, but my body betrayed me in silence, rooted in place as the kiss lingered just long enough to become real. When he pulled back he didn't apologize, didn't fumble, just looked at me calmly, like he'd done exactly what he meant to do. And I stood there blinking, heart pounding, not saying a word because I didn't trust what my mouth might let slip. I should have turned and walked out right then, let the door click shut behind me with the finality it deserved, but instead I stood there for a full minute, letting the taste of fruit and something far more dangerous settle into the back of my throat. That night, trying to pretend the air was still normal, I texted my friend, "Stopped by earlier to drop your stuff, but no one was home." And when she replied, "Weird, he was supposed to be out of town all day," I stared at the screen, pulse rising, the weight of those words settling like stone in my stomach. Something had shifted, not all at once, not like a slammed door or a snapped branch, but gradually, like the slow drip of a faucet that suddenly becomes impossible to ignore. And it showed up first in the mirror, in the way I tilted my head while brushing my hair, how I took an extra second to smooth my blouse and adjusted the neckline with more care than the day called for. I found myself reaching for lipstick before heading to the store for eggs, choosing the one that matched my skin tone just right, the one I hadn't worn since last year's anniversary dinner when he didn't notice I'd put it on, and I started lingering in front of my closet a little longer, bypassing the same 3 sweaters I usually cycled through and picking out something I hadn't worn in months, something that made my reflection feel slightly more alive. It wasn't about vanity, not really, it was about attention, about acknowledging some quiet part of me that had grown tired of being invisible even in my own skin, and I didn't want to be seen by the world, just maybe not forgotten by it either. Meanwhile, the calls from my husband became more frequent but not more intimate, little check-ins delivered with the precision of bullet points. Flight updates, client changes, hotel Wi-Fi complaints. And I listened the way someone listens to weather reports, knowing the pattern, bracing for the same tone every time. He asked how things were back home, if the gutters had been cleared, if I'd confirmed the reservation for the holiday trip, and I answered each question dutifully, ticking off my side of the checklist, feeling like a secretary in her own marriage. I didn't mention the kiss, or the ache that had grown in its silence, or the way I'd started dreaming in colors again after years of gray, because there wasn't a line item on his agenda for that kind of thing. One afternoon, caught between errands and a restless hunger I couldn't place, I ducked into the small cafe on the corner, the one with the scratched wooden tables and chipped mugs that never matched, and as I stood in line pretending to read the chalkboard menu, I felt it, his presence. Before I saw him, a quiet ripple just behind my shoulder, and when I turned he was there, leaning against the wall near the condiments, arms crossed. No smile on his face this time, no casual charm, just stillness, like he'd been waiting. My breath caught for a second, stupidly, like I hadn't rehearsed this moment in my head at least a dozen times, and for a few seconds we just stared at each other while people bustled past with paper cups and distracted glances. I stepped closer, not enough to draw attention, but enough to make the air between us shift, and I said carefully, deliberately, "That can't happen again." He nodded once, slow, respectful, the way someone might respond to a posted warning sign before stepping past it anyway, and then he said, "Do you really believe that?" His voice low, calm, not mocking but so sure of what he already knew. I didn't answer because the truth curled hot under my skin and made me want to lie to him, to myself, to everyone who still thought I was the kind of woman who knew the lines and kept them. I left with my coffee and walked the long way home, heart tapping out a rhythm that didn't match my pace, and as I turned the final corner toward my street, I realized the glass hadn't cracked this morning. It had been cracked a long time, maybe from the inside, maybe by all the years I spent holding things together that never really were. He returned on a Thursday evening, suitcase wheels bumping softly along the tile floor, the scent of his cologne arriving just before he did, and for a moment I felt like a guest in my own house, unsure where to stand or what expression to wear as I watched him step inside like nothing had changed while everything inside me had. He smiled the same way he always did, polite and faintly distracted, his arms around me for a beat too short to register as comfort, and I hugged him back with arms that remembered how but hands that felt foreign, unsure of the weight they were supposed to carry. He commented on the house smelling clean, thanked me for remembering to water the plants, asked what I'd been up to, and I rattled off errands and chores like I was reciting a grocery list, skipping the parts that mattered, the ones that might have stopped the air from sitting so awkwardly between us. We ordered takeout from the place we used to love years ago before routines turned into ruts, and we sat at the dining table like strangers rehearsing for a dinner scene, our silverware scraping plates, conversation polite but tight, two people who used to know each other's rhythms now tapping the surface for a pulse. Halfway through the meal, he looked up from his plate, his brow softening, and without saying a word, he leaned over and kissed me on the neck, slow and deliberate, like a man remembering something he once cherished but hadn't touched in too long, and my entire body locked in place as the warmth of it trickled down my spine and settled in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't that I didn't want to be touched, it was that I didn't know how to receive it anymore without guilt clinging to my skin like static. and as he lingered, his breath warm against my collarbone, I realized I was holding mine, trapped between the comfort of old muscle memory and the sharp sting of something I hadn't dared name. When he pulled back and smiled like it was nothing, like we did this all the time, I nodded and forced a soft chuckle, but inside my chest was a swirl of confusion, like I was living someone else's life in borrowed clothes. And I excused myself to the kitchen under the pretense of refilling water glasses just so I could let my breath out behind the safety of a cabinet door. I stared at the faucet, the chrome handle smudged with fingerprints, and wondered if he could sense it. If the silence I carried had shape and weight and temperature, if it echoed in our walls at night when I wasn't paying attention, or if I'd grown so good at hiding it that even I couldn't see it clearly anymore. After dinner, he turned on the TV, slipped off his shoes, and dozed off with his head tilted toward the couch cushion like he had 100 times before, and I watched him from the hallway, half in shadow, feeling like I was trespassing in my own marriage. I crawled into bed beside him later, limbs stiff with the effort of pretending everything felt normal, and just as I closed my eyes, my phone buzzed softly on the nightstand. I turned the screen down quickly, heart already racing even before I read the message, and when I finally lifted it, my pulse skipped, 5 words glowing against the dark. I left town. Come if. No name. No punctuation. No pressure. Just a door quietly left open, daring me to step through it, and as I stared at the message with the sound of his breathing steady beside me, I felt the ground tilt again beneath a life I had once believed was solid. I told him I was heading to the store, grabbing something for dinner, maybe restocking the pantry, tossing the words out like lint from my pocket, light and casual and easy to forget, and he didn't question it, just nodded from behind his laptop, murmuring something about checking the bank statements later, and I left without a coat even though the weather called for one because my skin felt too warm for reasons I couldn't name. The park was quiet that time of day, early enough to miss the joggers and late enough to avoid the dog walkers. Just rows of benches lined with fallen leaves and the steady whisper of branches swaying above like they were keeping secrets. I saw him before he saw me, leaning back on the far end of the bench, hood up, hands buried in his jacket pockets, eyes trained on the little lake where ducks circled the edge like they too were killing time. And for a second I just stood there, unsure if I should keep walking or turn back before my feet made too much noise and gave me away. When I finally sat beside him, close enough to feel the heat of his body but not enough to touch, he glanced over with that look of his, half smirk, half something heavier, and said, "I figured you wouldn't come," his voice quiet like the wind. I didn't answer, just stared out at the water, watching ripples fan out from nowhere, and then he added, "This is the last time," not like a threat or a plea, but like a decision he'd already made without asking if I agreed, and I felt the words slide into my chest and settle there like stones. He turned toward me fully now, elbows on his knees, gaze steady, and said, "I don't want to be the person you feel guilty around." And for a moment I hated how kind his voice was, how it didn't rise or crack, how it only made the guilt sharper. I told him I didn't know what I wanted, that everything felt tangled and wrong and a little too late, and he smiled then, soft and sad, like he'd already come to terms with something I was still running from. For a while we just sat there, letting the silence grow between us like moss, not heavy, not tense, just still. Then one of us cracked a joke, I can't remember which one, about the ducks being in a better relationship than either of us, and we both laughed, real and sudden, heads tilted back slightly like kids who'd forgotten the weight of adulthood for a moment. That laughter broke something open, not in a painful way but like sunlight through blinds, a tiny strip of warmth where cold had lived for too long, and we kept laughing, swapping dumb stories, his hand brushing mine on the bench by accident and neither of us pulling away. Eventually, the shadows stretched longer, and the air thinned with the kind of chill that made it hard to pretend time wasn't moving, and as we stood up, brushing leaves from our clothes, I knew what was coming before he stepped closer. The kiss was brief, softer than the last, more like punctuation than a sentence, a full stop at the end of something we didn't dare name, and when he pulled back he didn't say goodbye, didn't offer one more line to remember him by, just gave me a nod like we were both in on a secret that didn't need to be spoken. I watched him walk away down the gravel path, shoulders slightly hunched, hands in his pockets, and I stayed there longer than I should have, letting the wind settle over my skin like an apology, wondering if it was possible to miss someone who was never really yours to begin with. It started with a casual comment over coffee, my friend stirring sugar into her cup like it was any other morning, her voice light but edged just enough to make my stomach tighten before the words fully landed, and she said, "Oh, by the way, someone mentioned they saw you near the river walk last Thursday. Odd, huh? I thought you said you were just heading to the store." And she smiled as she said it, not accusatory, not even curious, just one of those offhand things people say when they're holding something behind their teeth and waiting to see if you'll bite. I blinked too long before answering, pretending to laugh as if I'd forgotten my own errand, muttering something about traffic and taking the long way back, and she nodded, accepting the answer but not quite believing it, sipping her drink while her eyes held mine for just a second too long. That night at home the air felt different, the kind of quiet that isn't peace but distance, and my husband, though kind, seemed to move around me with a new rhythm, more deliberate, more polite, his questions a little too careful and his silences a little too full, like he was studying a language he'd once spoken fluently but now didn't trust himself to get right. He brought me tea without being asked, rubbed my shoulder briefly as I passed him in the hallway, and smiled in that way people do when they're pretending not to notice the smoke curling up under a door they're not ready to open. At dinner he asked about my day with more interest than usual, eyes on me longer than they used to be, but his smile didn't quite reach the corners, and when I offered the usual list of chores and errands, his nod was slow, almost thoughtful, like he was cataloging every word I said for later review. I couldn't tell if he knew something or if I'd just been so far away that now even my return felt like an intrusion, but the walls of our house, which once held routine and silence comfortably, now felt like they were leaning in, listening, waiting for me to slip. My phone stayed face down on the nightstand, not because I had anything to hide in that moment but because I didn't want to face the part of myself that waited for it to light up, and every vibration now felt like a threat, every glance in my direction like a question I wasn't ready to answer. The guilt didn't hit in a single wave. It seeped like water through old caulk, slow and steady and impossible to patch without tearing the whole thing apart, and I found myself talking too much or not enough, overcompensating with kindness or shrinking from small gestures, caught between the woman I was pretending to be and the one I'd let slip through the cracks. The truth was, I no longer believed my own performance, and every moment spent inside that house felt like a dress rehearsal for a version of myself I no longer wanted to play. And yet I showed up anyway, cooked the dinners, answered the texts, smiled when expected, even as something inside me frayed with every false note. It wasn't just about being found out. It was about the unbearable weight of knowing I had become someone I didn't recognize, and no matter how carefully I moved or how many times I rehearsed the lines, I could feel the shift happening all around me, like the air had changed and I was the only one pretending not to notice. It was already dark when I stepped out, the air heavy with that late evening stillness that wraps around you like a whisper, and I told myself I was just dropping off a book, just stopping by quickly, nothing more than a neighborly visit, though the pulse in my wrist told a different story, and my reflection in the hallway mirror looked like a woman trying to outrun her own thoughts. I rang the doorbell twice, then knocked softly, phone in hand, waiting for my friend to answer like she always did, cheerful and distracted, usually mid-laugh or mid-rant about some minor disaster in her kitchen. But tonight there was only silence, thick and unmoving, and after a long minute, the door creaked open and he stood there, barefoot, hair damp from a recent shower, wearing a t-shirt that hung too casually over his frame, and in that instant I should have turned around, should have said, I'd come back later, should have remembered how quickly things unravel when you play with fire you can't control. Instead I stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind me with the kind of finality that doesn't sound loud until you're already past the point of return, and we stood there in the hallway, a few feet between us, like two people caught in a moment they didn't know how to step out of. He asked if everything was okay and I nodded too quickly, saying something vague about the book, how I'd meant to return it earlier, my voice a little too bright and brittle, and he listened quietly, eyes searching my face like he was trying to read something I hadn't written down. We moved to the edge of the living room, both of us standing awkwardly, the tension stretching between us like fabric pulled too tight, and then he said softly, I thought you weren't coming anymore. His voice low, almost disappointed, and I looked at him with everything I couldn't say filling the space between us. I shook my head, took a breath and told him, I shouldn't have, but I didn't leave and neither did he, and when he stepped closer, it wasn't bold or hungry or reckless. It was hesitant, almost unsure, as if he was waiting for me to stop him and I didn't. The kiss came slowly, his lips brushing mine with the gentleness of someone afraid to press too hard, and I leaned in, not from passion but from something far more dangerous. The desire to feel known, even if only for a moment, and it wasn't fireworks, it wasn't heat, it was a sad kind of sweetness, like a memory already turning into a regret, and I knew before we even pulled apart that this would be the last. Then the sound came, quiet but devastating, the soft creak of the door opening behind us, and we both turned, breath caught as she stepped into the frame, her eyes wide but unreadable, arms at her sides, mouth slightly open like she'd been about to speak and forgot what she wanted to say. No one moved. No one said a word. The silence cracked in the middle like thin glass, and she stood there just long enough for the weight of her gaze to settle into my bones, then turned and disappeared down the hallway without slamming the door, without a sound, and the absence of anger made it worse than any accusation could have. I left moments later, heart pounding, palms damp, trying to remember if I'd even said goodbye, and that night I lay in bed fully clothed, eyes wide, the room too still, waiting for something, anything, to reset the world I'd just shattered. The next morning I woke to the sound of a suitcase being zipped, the wheels rolling across the floor like thunder on a quiet street, and when I stepped into the hallway he was already at the door, coat on, keys in hand, and he looked at me, just once, not long, not cruel, just long enough to let me know that he knew, and then he walked out without saying a single word. There were no more calls, no more messages, no more visits, and for the first time in what felt like years, the house was quiet in a way that wasn't comforting but suffocating, the kind of silence that wraps around you like a cloak and leaves you questioning how much of yourself you've lost just to make everything else feel like it's still intact. Neither my husband nor my friend reached out, and it wasn't out of neglect. It was because, somewhere between the cracked moments and the hushed confessions, they both had already made their choices, and the distance that grew between us wasn't physical but invisible, a slow stretch of space that neither of them bothered to bridge. I could feel it in the way my husband's absence became my routine, in the way my friend's unread messages sat like unopened gifts on my phone, left for too long to matter. The city outside, which had once pulsed with life, with noise, with possibility, now felt like a stranger's backdrop, familiar but foreign, and each step I took on the cracked sidewalk seemed to echo louder than the last, reminding me that I had become a ghost in a world I couldn't escape from. I spent my days moving through the motions, picking up groceries, running errands, each task heavier than the one before, but nothing in the routine felt like it belonged to me anymore, as if I were living someone else's life in borrowed shoes. It was around the fourth day that I found myself, without thinking, opening a new message to him, the young man whose face had become a familiar ghost in the back of my mind, the one whose name I hadn't spoken out loud since that night. I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, unsure of what I wanted to say, if I even had anything left to say that mattered. My heart drummed loudly in my chest, and I typed out a few words, then erased them, then typed again, a simple message: I'm here. If you want to talk. My thumb hovered above the send button for a long, agonizing moment, the weight of it heavier than any word could express, before finally, with a shaky breath, I pressed send, watching the screen flicker as it disappeared into the ether. I waited. And I waited. He read it. The small double check appeared, but there was no reply. No explanation. No response. Just a cold, endless silence that lingered longer than I could bear. I stared at the phone until my vision blurred, and then I tossed it aside, suddenly overwhelmed by the crushing weight of how nothing had changed, how it all had slipped through my fingers, as though the world outside was as distant and unreachable as the people I once cared for. I moved to the window, needing something to hold on to focus on. The streets below were bustling, cars honking, people walking with purpose, their lives running parallel to mine, and yet none of it felt real anymore. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been left behind, caught in a still frame while the world moved on without me. I glanced across the street, hoping for some sign of life, some reassurance that I wasn't the only one suspended in time, but the windows across from mine were dark, no lights, no movement, no sign of anyone at all. The emptiness seemed to echo louder, and for the first time since everything had started unraveling, I realized just how alone I truly was. Months had passed, the kind of time that quietly wears down everything you think you know about yourself, and I found myself in a new city, in a new life, one where the walls didn't echo with memories of things I wasn't ready to face. And yet, no matter how many new beginnings I shoved between the cracks of my old self, the weight of what had been wouldn't leave. I had moved to a small apartment on the edge of town, close enough to the school I now taught at, the one where I had hoped that distance would somehow erase the ghosts of the past, and yet, every morning I woke up to the same cup, the chipped one, the one that had been with me through every hour of the same routine, a silent witness to everything I hadn't been able to fix. I had bought new furniture, new plates, new curtains, everything that seemed to scream fresh start. But the small crack in the cup, barely visible but undeniable, remained, and no matter how many times I replaced other things, that one imperfection stayed, a tiny reminder of the things I had let slip through my hands. It wasn't the cup that hurt, not really. It was everything it represented, everything I couldn't mend, the parts of me that kept breaking even when I wasn't looking. I threw myself into my work, grading papers, planning lessons, trying to fill the void with purpose and progress. But the truth was, every time I smiled at a student, every time I answered a question, a part of me was still somewhere else, still frozen in that moment when everything changed. One evening, while scanning the local paper for events to pass the weekend, my eyes caught a headline that made my heart skip. A small article about a new coffee shop opening in a neighboring city. And there it was, his name, the one I hadn't spoken aloud in months, followed by the words, grand opening. The article didn't mention much else, just that he'd opened it in a different city, far enough to make it almost laughable to think that I could just show up and pretend I was just another customer in a new place. And yet, the thought of him, the idea of crossing that boundary, of somehow reaching across the silence that had grown between us, made something stir inside me that I hadn't felt in too long. It didn't take long to decide. I found a weekend free, packed a bag like I was setting out on a casual trip, and drove the hours to the city where the cafe stood, a small corner spot that smelled like roasted beans and cinnamon, the same place I imagined him crafting lattes and offering polite smiles to strangers. When I stepped inside, the hum of the espresso machine, the soft chatter of patrons felt familiar, and yet everything in me seemed to freeze as I saw him behind the counter, his back turned, moving through the motions of his new life, and for a second, I wondered if I had imagined all of it. If I had convinced myself that there was something between us when there really hadn't been. He turned when he heard the bell above the door, his eyes locking with mine, and there was a flicker of recognition, a moment of pause before his smile shifted, and I knew that he didn't quite remember me, not fully, not in the way I had hoped. He stepped forward, wiped his hands on the apron, and asked if I was here for coffee, if I was new to the area, and I nodded, swallowing back the words that had been waiting on my tongue. He made the order, a simple cappuccino, and handed it over with a casual smile, and we stood there for a moment, the distance between us both too wide and too close at the same time. I smiled too, the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes, the kind that spoke more of goodbye than of a beginning, and I sat at the nearest table, the silence between us stretched but unspoken, as we both pretended that nothing had ever happened, that this moment didn't feel like the end of something that had never really started. And so we both sat there, the coffee cold in my hand, two people who had known each other but had never truly seen one another, both too cautious to speak the words we both knew but could never admit. And in that quiet corner of the cafe, I realized that some things, some connections, are meant to be left behind even when you want to reach for them. And maybe, just maybe, we never will.